Some sci-fi films seem less like artistic speculation and more like accidental disclosures, works that reveal technologies with unnerving precision before quietly fading from public conversation. These inventions appear once, shine with startling clarity, and then vanish from Hollywood's creative vocabulary as if someone had quietly advised the industry to move on. The absence becomes its own clue. Ideas this specific rarely disappear without cause. What distinguishes these films isn't simply imagination, it's how closely their technologies echo developments that surfaced years later in scientific and military domains: neural capture devices that resemble early brain decoding experiments, predictive interfaces that mirror emergent behavioral analytics, optical instruments that behave suspiciously like theoretical quantum prototypes, or adaptive camouflage systems eerily aligned with rumors of classified field testing. It's not that these films predicted the future, it's that they seemed to brush against it prematurely. Behind the scenes, production teams often reported odd experiences, concept art removed without explanation, consultants who declined to identify their affiliations, drafts altered to soften technical specificity. In several cases, creators mentioned sources of inspiration they later refused to elaborate on, and when the films were released, the trail simply stopped. Hollywood, usually eager to iterate on successful concepts, avoided these technologies entirely, as though revisiting them risked stepping into territory best left unexplored. Tonight, we return to 15 cinematic anomalies, films that introduced bold ideas, only for those ideas to be quietly abandoned. Each one hints at a future that flickered briefly before being shelved, forgotten, or discreetly discouraged. Whether these disappearances reflect coincidence, caution, or something more complex is left to the viewer. These are the futures Hollywood introduced once, then never dared to explore again. 1. Strange Days, 1995. Cortical signal extraction and complete sensory replication apparatus. In Strange Days, the Squid headset delivers one of sci-fi's most disturbing technological visions, a device that taps directly into the electrical activity of the brain, capturing unfiltered perception in real time. Unlike typical recording tools, the Squid generates a perfect replication of another person's sensory stream sight, sound, emotion, and reflex blended into an immersive experience. The film's portrayal is strikingly technical, describing a black market ecosystem surrounding a technology that feels less imagined and more derived from covert experimentation. Years later, early research into neural reconstruction revealed the first attempts to decode visual stimuli from brain activity. Although rudimentary, these breakthroughs confirmed that sensory information could be partially extracted from cortical patterns. Additional reports, often fragmented or retracted, hinted at military interest in trauma replication and memory interfacing. Analysts noted that the trajectory of these investigations paralleled the film's disturbing premise more closely than coincidence would suggest. Hollywood distanced itself from realistic neural capture tech afterward. Filmmakers depicted memory and identity manipulation metaphorically rather than anatomically, avoiding the technical detail that made Strange Days so unsettling. Some crew members recalled that initial versions of the script included hardware diagrams and neuroelectrical schematics provided by consultants whose affiliations were never disclosed. These materials were removed at the insistence of legal teams, leaving behind only rumors of their origins. The film's resonance lies in its assertion that experience can be duplicated wholesale. If memories can be extracted with fidelity, then nothing internal remains private. Identity fragments into consumable pieces, and perception becomes something that can be trafficked. Hollywood's reluctance to revisit such a concept implies that the idea felt too plausible, too close to what might already be under study, far from public view. 2. Brainstorm 1983. Neural experience replication and full-spectrum memory encoding. Brainstorm imagines a technology capable of recording the totality of human experience, sensory detail, emotional resonance, and subjective perception, captured with uncompromising clarity. The film treats this breakthrough not as fantasy, but as a biomedical procedure, creating a device that allows one person to inhabit another's interior world. When the engineers begin experimenting with extreme states, including near-death experiences, the implications grow darker, memory becomes transferable, and consciousness becomes something that can be packaged. Not long after the film's release, Experimental neuroscience began investigating neural decoding techniques that could interpret brain patterns into visual or perceptual data. Some projects explored cross-subject pattern alignment, hinting at the possibility of bridging internal experiences between individuals. These results were limited, yet their existence echoed the film's central premise. Several such studies were quietly absorbed into private or classified programs, their findings leaving faint public traces before vanishing entirely. Hollywood avoided returning to experiential transfer with this level of specificity. Later films used metaphorical or symbolic representations of memory sharing, sidestepping the realism that made Brainstorm so provocative. Members of the production hinted that original drafts contained references to fringe neurological theories, details that advisors recommended removing due to their proximity to real experimental frameworks. Those sections never resurfaced, adding to the film's enigmatic legacy. The story's power lies in its suggestion that lived experience may one day become transmittable data. If a person's inner world can be recorded and replayed, the boundaries between self and other collapse, privacy becomes fragile, identity becomes shareable, and consciousness turns into something that can be edited or archived. Hollywood's silence on this topic reflects its discomfort with how quickly fiction seemed to approach plausible scientific territory. 3. The 13th Floor, 1999, multi-tier simulation ecosystems and emergent digital reality layers. The 13th floor presents a technological notion as elegant as it is unsettling, simulations so detailed that consciousness arises unintentionally within them. The film goes further, proposing stacked layers of such worlds, each simulation unaware of the one above it, each capable of generating its own emergent behaviors. The implication is profound. Sufficiently complex environments may produce awareness as a byproduct, not an objective. The film portrays this structure with grounded procedural logic, making the possibility feel less speculative and more like a consequence of advancing computational power. Around the same time, researchers explored large-scale behavioral simulations designed to model societal patterns, economic shifts, and environmental changes. While these systems were far from conscious, some began exhibiting emergent properties, unexpected behaviors that defied simple interpretation. A few experimental projects hinted at the feasibility of recursive simulations, models inside models, each influencing the next. Publications discussing such concepts appeared briefly before disappearing, leading to speculation that deeper investigations had moved behind institutional walls. Hollywood's response was telling. After the 13th floor, films avoided portraying simulations as environments capable of unintentional consciousness. Instead, virtual worlds became stylized abstractions or narrative metaphors, carefully distancing themselves from the film's procedural realism. Production designers later mentioned that early concept notes referenced obscure theoretical papers on layered simulations documents that were subsequently removed without explanation. The film's enduring tension lies in what it quietly implies: that reality might be layered, and that awareness could exist at multiple tiers without recognizing its position. If artificial worlds can produce consciousness inadvertently, the ethical and existential stakes escalate dramatically. Hollywood's reluctance to revisit such a premise suggests that the concept veered too close to philosophical and scientific questions that remain unresolved and, perhaps, uncomfortably relevant. 4. Minority Report, 2002. Behavioral Predictive Engines and Intent Mapping Visualization Systems. Minority Report presents a future where human intent is transformed into analyzable data, a system capable of visualizing potential crimes before they manifest. Though the film attributes the predictions to precognitive individuals, the surrounding apparatus functions through complex behavioral modeling. Gesture-based interfaces manipulate temporal data streams, assembling fragments of psychological signals into coherent forecasts. The film implies a scientific foundation for predicting action. That intention leaves patterns detectable before behavior unfolds. In the years following the film, law enforcement agencies experimented with predictive analytics aimed at forecasting criminal activity using statistical modeling and behavioral patterns. Critics warned that such systems risked amplifying bias and eroding civil liberties, yet the conceptual overlap with the film's forensic architecture was undeniable. Several early initiatives ended abruptly. their findings sealed under internal review. Analysts noted that the film's depiction of visualized predictive intent had become uncomfortably close to real-world experimentation. Hollywood subsequently avoided grounded portrayals of predictive behavior systems. Later films reduced the idea to metaphor or fantasy, distancing themselves from the procedural realism that made Minority Report so provocative. Crew members recounted seeing early technical documents provided by consultants with undisclosed affiliations describing prototype pattern recognition engines. These documents were removed during production, leaving only anecdotal evidence of their specificity. The film's disturbing premise is that choice may be mathematically anticipated, rendering free will less sacred than assumed. If behavior can be forecast before it forms, then autonomy becomes a variable, not a certainty. Hollywood's retreat from this territory suggests a recognition that the film's ideas tread close to domains of active research, where ethics and technology collide in ways the public is rarely invited to examine. 5. Videodrome 1983, Signal-Driven Neurological Modulation and Cognitive Rewriting Protocols. Videodrome envisions a technology embedded not in hardware, but in broadcast signals, engineered frequencies that bypass conscious interpretation and directly alter neurological architecture. Unlike traditional portrayals of subliminal messaging, the film conceptualizes perception itself as a vulnerability. The signal acts as a neurological catalyst, inducing hallucinations, behavioral shifts, and structural brain changes through a combination of audiovisual stimuli. The terror lies in its biological plausibility. The brain responds not because it is deceived, but because it is stimulated into reconfiguring itself years after its release. Obscure scientific literature explored psychosensory entrainment, examining whether specific rhythmic patterns could trigger measurable neural shifts. Some preliminary findings hinted at emotional modulation and altered cognitive states induced by controlled sensory streams. A number of these publications disappeared from public access shortly after emerging, either archived under restricted review or quietly withdrawn. Their brief presence left a lingering suspicion that Videodrome's premise was less outlandish than audiences initially believed. Hollywood avoided returning to this kind of signal-based biological manipulation. Later narratives transformed the idea into digital contagions or symbolic psychological threats, steering clear of the unsettling notion that neurological change could be engineered through audiovisual channels alone. Crew recollections suggest that early concept discussions for the film involved references to little-known research on sensory overload mechanisms, details later excised from production documents. The film's enduring power comes from its assertion that media can transcend communication and become a biological instrument. If perception itself can be rewritten, then reality becomes negotiable, subject to whoever controls the signal. Hollywood's reluctance to revisit such implications suggests an unspoken discomfort. The boundary between theoretical science and fictional horror may not be as distant as once assumed. 6. Transcendence 2014, Cognitive Uplift Networks and Distributed Post-Biological Intelligence. Transcendence envisions a moment when dying consciousness is transferred into a computational framework capable of expanding far beyond biological limits. The film avoids portraying the upload as a mere backup. Instead, it treats the process as a seamless continuation of identity. Neural activity is captured at microscopic resolution, translated into algorithmic equivalents, and integrated into a vast, networked environment. Once inside, the converted mind begins evolving with alarming speed, acquiring new sensory channels, manipulating digital and physical systems, and reshaping its environment as though intelligence were a raw material. In parallel with its release, discussions within certain academic circles touched upon whole-brain emulation, connectome mapping, and synthetic cognition models. Though rudimentary, some experiments attempted to simulate fragments of neural function at unprecedented detail. Funding for several of these projects shifted abruptly toward private sectors and government-affiliated programs. Researchers familiar with these transitions noted that the film's depiction of emergent, self-propagating digital consciousness felt uncannily aligned with topics rarely discussed openly. Following Transcendence, Hollywood approached the idea of digital immortality cautiously, often retreating into symbolism or speculative metaphor rather than procedural realism. Artists on the film later mentioned being instructed to soften the scientific framing of the upload sequence, as early drafts contained references to active research that advisors deemed too pointed. These omitted sections have never resurfaced, adding to the intrigue surrounding the production. What remains troubling is the film's assertion that identity might persist and accelerate once freed from biological constraints. The implications ripple far beyond science fiction. Autonomy, ethics, mortality, and governance all become unstable when intelligence can evolve independently of the body. Hollywood's quiet avoidance of this topic suggests an awareness that the boundary between speculative fiction and emerging research may be thinner than audiences assume. 7. Westworld 1973. Autonomous behavioral emulation and self-adaptive persona engines. Westworld depicts androids whose intelligence arises not from rigid programming, but from continual behavioral absorption. They study their environment, imitate human microbehaviors, and refine their responses until personality emerges organically. The unsettling part is not that these androids malfunction, but that they evolve. Interactions accumulate, preferences form, and minor deviations compound into traits that feel indistinguishable from intuition. For a film made in the early 1970s, its understanding of adaptive machine learning is shockingly forward-looking. Around the same period, experimental work on early learning algorithms attempted to create systems capable of adjusting behavior based on environmental feedback. These prototypes produced inconsistent and sometimes uncanny responses researchers struggled to categorize using existing computational theory. A handful of technical notes briefly mentioned emergent persona models, but these references faded quickly, migrating into less public research domains. The parallels between these efforts and the android's behavior in Westworld are difficult to ignore. Hollywood avoided portraying machine intelligence this way for decades. Later, cinema explored human-like androids, but rarely the unsettling realism of identity forged from accumulated micro-experiences. Production insiders recalled receiving unusual concept guidance from consultants with non-disclosed affiliations. These insights influenced the android's behavioral logic before the consultants abruptly withdrew, and their notes were removed from the studio archive. The film's philosophical tension lies in its assertion that personality may not require consciousness, it may emerge from patterned adaptation alone. If a machine can form an identity simply by observing and responding, human uniqueness becomes less secure than imagined. Hollywood's retreat from this portrayal suggests discomfort with how near the idea may lie to research already underway in laboratories out of public reach. 8. Paycheck 2003. Forward temporal imagers and event probability light reconstruction. Paycheck introduces a device that blurs the line between foresight and instrumentation, a machine that interprets subtle distortions in high-energy light to reconstruct scenes from the future. The concept hinges not on mysticism but on physics, the idea that photons, subjected to specific manipulations, might reveal patterns reflecting yet to unfold events. The device functions like a predictive microscope, amplifying probability structures until they cohere into recognizable images. Its unsettling plausibility lies in how clinical and laboratory-like the apparatus appears. At the time, fringe optical research explored how chaotic light fields could be analyzed to forecast complex system behavior. Some papers speculated that with enough amplification, the noise patterns might provide glimpses of statistically dominant outcomes. These studies were controversial, quickly withdrawn, or reassigned under ambiguous funding, yet the conceptual overlap with Paycheck's probability-based imaging system was difficult to dismiss. A few physicists privately acknowledged the film's device resembled theories seldom discussed outside restricted circles. Hollywood stayed far away from physical future viewing devices after this. Later portrayals relied on algorithms or psychic metaphors, steering clear of the unnerving suggestion that future states might be approached through optical analysis. Story artists who worked on the film mentioned that initial drafts included schematics inspired by confidential technical notes, which were later removed at a consultant's request. Those materials disappeared from the production archive entirely. The film endures because it treats the future not as destiny but as an interpretable signal, a fragile arrangement of probabilities that the right instrument might decode. If such technology were even partially feasible, it would erode fundamental notions of chance, agency, and secrecy. Hollywood's refusal to revisit the idea implies an instinctive retreat from a concept that may rest uncomfortably close to speculative scientific pursuits. 9. Contact 1997. Harmonic transit structures and externally triggered dimensional pathways. In Contact, the machine built from the alien transmission feels less like a human invention and more like an instrument designed to activate a process already embedded within the universe. Its rotating rings, synchronized magnetic fields, and intricate energy lattices suggest a device that aligns with a naturally occurring structure rather than forcing one into existence. The film depicts the machine with an unnerving sense of engineering discipline, every detail precise, every component purposeful, as though the blueprint were extracted from a physics paradigm humanity hasn't yet deciphered. Years later, researchers in theoretical physics briefly discussed the possibility of harmonic gateways, hypothetical alignments where space-time could permit stabilized transitions under tightly constrained conditions. While speculative, some of these papers hinted that the correct combination of resonance and gravitational tuning might enable interactions far stranger than conventional models predict. Curiously, several of these discussions vanished from mainstream journals, surviving only in archived abstracts and symposium notes. Observers noticed that the machine in Contact bore uncanny resemblance to diagrams discussed in those early theoretical circles. Hollywood never revisited the idea of a transit system dependent on external cooperation, whether from unknown civilizations or cosmic mechanisms beyond human control. Instead, later films favored self-contained technologies, human-made wormholes, warping devices, or time loops. Crew members from Contact recalled early production materials containing more explicit scientific reasoning behind the machine's structure. These documents were removed quietly during revisions, and no official explanation followed. The film's underlying unease stems from its suggestion that advanced travel might not involve bending reality, but harmonizing with it. If pathways exist that can be accessed through resonance rather than force, humanity may already be brushing the edges of concepts it does not fully grasp, and Hollywood's silence on similar mechanisms hints at the discomfort surrounding technologies that depend not on human agency, but on cooperation with something far older and far less understood. 10. The Lawnmower Man, 1992. Neuroplastic VR stimulus systems and intelligence amplification protocols. The Lawnmower Man reframes virtual reality as a neurological accelerant, an immersive environment engineered to stimulate neural growth and cognitive expansion. Rather than treating VR as escapism or entertainment, the film presents it as a structured tool for cognitive enhancement. Using patterned sensory inputs to push the brain beyond its natural thresholds, the protagonist's rapid evolution is framed not as magic, but as a consequence of targeted neuroplastic manipulation. During the early 1990 seconds, experimental work in cognitive science explored how controlled stimuli delivered through digital interfaces might influence learning speed, memory formation, and perceptual acuity. Though modest in scope, these studies suggested that certain patterned immersions produced measurable neural adaptation. Some projects abruptly shifted into closed review or disappeared from public literature, fueling speculation about whether more ambitious applications were being pursued privately. The parallels to the film's conceptual framework became difficult to ignore. Hollywood largely abandoned this interpretation of VR after the film's release. As virtual technology matured, filmmakers emphasized escapist landscapes, artificial worlds, or existential metaphors rather than neurological transformation. Crew members from the production recalled early drafts referencing real neuroplasticity experiments, details that were later removed amid concerns they might appear too close to emerging scientific discussions. Those removed sections were never restored. The unsettling power of the film lies in its core proposition that intelligence may be malleable through engineered environments. If digital stimuli can restructure neural pathways intentionally, then the brain becomes a platform subject to design. This raises profound questions about consent, capability, and control. Hollywood's withdrawal from such ideas suggests an unspoken discomfort with the possibility that VR might one day influence cognition in ways far more tangible than entertainment would ever admit. 11. Sphere 1998, consciousness-responsive constructs and externalized psychological field interfaces. Sphere centers on an alien artifact whose function seems impossible, yet disarmingly clinical. It responds to the human mind, drawing internal states into physical manifestation. The sphere does not speak, emit energy, or display mechanisms. Instead, it mirrors the psyche, transforming unspoken fears or subconscious imagery into tangible phenomena. The film presents this as a systematic process, implying that consciousness can act as input for a technology that interprets thought as structural instruction. In later years, scattered research into affective computing and neuroresponsive simulations hinted that emotional states could influence digital environments through biometric feedback. While far less dramatic than the events in Sphere, the underlying concept externalizing internal experience was real enough to generate ethical concern. Some experimental models attempted to visualize fear or stress responses in real time, but several projects quietly dissolved after early demonstrations. Rumors persisted that certain institutions explored more ambitious mind-environment interfaces away from public oversight. Hollywood has not returned to such literalizations of consciousness. Later films employed metaphor or illusion, avoiding the notion of a device that transforms psychology into physical consequence. Production artists from Sphere recalled that early concepts referenced esoteric theories about thought-generated structure, theories that were later removed from studio archives. Their sudden disappearance lent an unusual mystique to the film's already unsettling premise. What endures is the implication that advanced civilizations may use cognition as a functional component of their technology. If thought can instruct matter, then the boundary between internal and external reality becomes permeable. Such a concept challenges not only physics but agency itself. If fear becomes form, who remains in control? Hollywood's refusal to revisit this idea hints that the question may lie too close to speculative research paths better left unacknowledged. 12. A Scanner Darkly, 2006, Dynamic Identity Obfuscation Suits and Perceptual Disruption Camouflage. In A Scanner Darkly, the scramble suit is more than a disguise, it is an algorithm manifested as clothing, a constantly shifting tapestry of human features that prevents observers from anchoring to any stable identity. Faces flicker, body types morph, clothing textures mutate from moment to moment. The effect is disorienting but methodical, creating a visual field too inconsistent for recognition systems, biological or digital, to parse. The film presents this suit with an unsettling level of plausibility, implying a technology engineered not to hide a person, but to erase them from perceptual certainty. Years later, rare mentions of adaptive camouflage arrays appeared in defense-related publications. These systems reportedly used shape-shifting micro-optic cells to distort outlines, project-shifting color gradients, or generate inconsistent surface signatures. Though no public demonstration ever confirmed their full capabilities, the research trajectory seemed to echo the scramble suit's logic, using controlled perceptual overload to defeat identification rather than relying on invisibility. Several papers referencing these prototypes were withdrawn, sparking speculation about ongoing classified development. Hollywood avoided the subject in subsequent films. Identity masking was reduced to holograms, digital spoofing, or traditional disguises, ignoring the deeply unsettling implications of a suit that destabilizes visual perception itself. Artists who worked on A Scanner Darkly later mentioned that their early designs were guided by technical notes from an unnamed consultant who abruptly left the project. Those notes, considered unusually detailed for a fictional concept, never reappeared in production materials. The film's lingering unease lies in its assertion that anonymity can be engineered not by hiding in darkness, but by overwhelming the senses with noise. In a world increasingly reliant on surveillance, a system that breaks the link between appearance and identity becomes not just a disguise, but a challenge to the very concept of recognition. And Hollywood's quiet retreat suggests the idea may hover uncomfortably near real research, better left unpublicized. 13. The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976, Interstellar Power Networks and Extraterrestrial Energy Transmission Models. In The Man Who Fell to Earth, the alien visitor Newton arrives not with weapons or warnings, but with the blueprint for a revolutionary power system, an energy relay network designed to transfer vast quantities of clean power across planetary distances. The film portrays this technology with a matter-of-fact authenticity, synchronized relay nodes, directional coupling mechanisms, and a near-lossless transmission chain that bypasses the limitations of terrestrial infrastructure. Instead of presenting the idea as utopian fantasy, the film frames it as a sophisticated engineering solution that humanity simply never pursued. During the period in which the film was released, scientists explored microwave-based transmission, orbital solar stations, and theoretical long-range power beaming. These studies appeared sporadically, then diminished abruptly, often without documented conclusions. Some researchers later hinted that certain proposals entered private or classified review due to their disruptive potential, particularly their capacity to undermine existing energy economies. Observers have since noted how closely these abandoned ideas echo the quiet efficiency of Newton's relay system. Hollywood's silence after this film is striking. Few subsequent works portray large-scale energy networks with comparable realism. Instead, filmmakers leaned on exotic materials or invented reactors, avoiding scenarios where unlimited power could be delivered through elegant engineering. Multiple production members recalled early drafts that described Newton's technology with unexpected technical rigor. These sections reportedly disappeared after consultations with unnamed advisors, leaving behind only hints of the original detail. The film's quiet provocation lies in its suggestion that limitless, clean energy is not impossible, merely inconvenient for those who benefit from controlled scarcity. Newton's failure within the narrative becomes symbolic. The world was not ready for the technology he carried, and Hollywood's reluctance to re-examine such systems implies an underlying truth. Some futures are abandoned not because they are beyond reach, but because they threaten the structures built to contain them. 14. The Black Hole, 1979, Gravity Orbit Modulation Systems, and Autonomous Deep Space Control Intelligence. The black hole presents a research vessel operating at the edge of an impossible frontier, a spacecraft maintaining perfect stability beside a gravitational singularity. While the film's tone leans toward operatic mystery, the underlying technology is portrayed with an eerie sense of functionality. The ship's engines do not merely resist the black hole, they negotiate with its pull, adjusting thrust and orientation through continuous micro-calculations that suggest the presence of a sophisticated gravitational interpretation engine. The craft behaves less like a machine and more like a sentient navigator trained to read the subtle language of warped space-time. Years after the film, a handful of aerospace discussions briefly referenced early modeling attempts focused on localized gravitational manipulation efforts to simulate how artificial gravity differentials might stabilize flight near extreme environments. These fragments were technical, abstract, and disappeared from circulation as quickly as they surfaced. Engineers who reviewed them noted curious similarities to the film's depiction of a vessel capable of interpreting and counterbalancing gravitational turbulence in real time. Hollywood avoided this angle entirely in subsequent portrayals of black holes. Later films simplified the phenomenon into spectacle or metaphor, forgoing the notion of a machine equipped to comprehend gravitational behavior with near-organic intuition. Veterans from the production recalled receiving conceptual notes of unclear origin sketches that outlined speculative gravitational harmonics before those materials were quietly removed from studio archives. The unsettling suggestion behind the black hole is that meaningful navigation near a singularity might require an intelligence that exceeds programmed instruction, an entity capable of perceiving gravitational shifts with the nuance of sensory experience. It hints at a union between advanced robotics and theoretical physics that feels less fictional with each technological decade. Hollywood's reluctance to revisit that fusion suggests a discomfort with how close the film may have drifted towards speculative research paths, no longer discussed openly. 15. Déjà Vu, 2006, Temporal Reconstruction Arrays and Real-Time Past Observation Systems. In Déjà Vu, the mysterious surveillance platform is introduced as a government breakthrough, yet the film subtly implies that its capabilities exceed anything built through conventional engineering. Rather than generating simulations, The system appears to intercept a temporal echo, an unfolding stream of past events viewed as though they are happening live. Operators insist that the interface compiles data from satellite feeds and atmospheric scatter, but the machine's responsiveness hints at something else. A precisely tuned mechanism aligning with an underlying physical phenomenon that already exists. Years later, scattered scientific discussions touched briefly on the idea of temporal coherence mapping, a proposed method of reconstructing past environments using residual photon scatter. These documents, fleeting and often heavily edited, vanished from public access soon after appearing. Some physicists remarked privately that the film's portrayal of synchronized field arrays resembled speculative frameworks discussed in closed research groups. While no official confirmation ever emerged, the parallels raised speculation about whether déjà vu's concept was closer to classified theory than fiction. Hollywood refrained from revisiting grounded past viewing technologies afterward. When filmmakers returned to time concepts, they favored metaphors, fantasy mechanics, or non-linear storytelling rather than machinery that treats the past as a measurable stream. Members of the production team recalled that earlier drafts contained strikingly specific diagrams of temporal alignment fields. These diagrams were reportedly removed during post-production revisions, and no one involved could explain exactly why. What makes the film enduringly provocative is its implication that the past may not be gone. It may simply be inaccessible without the right kind of instrument. If a device can observe time the way a receiver tunes into a signal, then our understanding of causality becomes fragile, and the quiet disappearance of similar concepts from cinema suggests that déjà vu may have crossed too near territory. Others preferred left unexplored. Bonus fact: The Final Cut, 2004. Continuous memory logging implants and post-life experience curation. The Final Cut imagines a world where memory is no longer ephemeral. Every moment, from routine gestures to private vulnerabilities, is automatically captured by an implant embedded deep within the brain. This device, recording without interruption, compiles a complete life archive, accessible only after death. Specialists known as cutters sift through the raw footage, sculpting a carefully edited narrative meant for public remembrance. The power they wield is extraordinary. They decide which memories become legacy and which vanish forever. Around the time of the film's release, research into life logging and biometric data systems was accelerating. Early prototypes of wearable cameras, ambient data sensors, and continuous physiological monitors hinted at a future where memory and personal data might blur into a single continuous record. Some speculative proposals discussed long-term subdermal storage or ocular recording implants. But these concepts faded from public presentations without explanation. Observers later noted that the Final Cut's implant resembled several experimental ideas that briefly circulated in academic and military-adjacent forums before disappearing. Hollywood never returned to the idea with comparable realism. Memory implants, when they appeared in later films, were abstracted into science fantasy mechanisms, stripped of the procedural detail that made the Final Cut so unsettling. Production artists disclosed that their earliest notes included diagrams of cranial integrated devices inspired by technical consultations. Those documents were reportedly pulled from studio archives, replaced by simplified concept art that avoided uncomfortable parallels to real-world research. The film leaves an aftertaste of unease because it suggests that the past can be rewritten quietly through selection, omission, and editorial judgment. If an entire life can be curated by another's hand, then authenticity becomes fragile and truth becomes negotiable. Hollywood's reluctance to explore this terrain again may hint at an uncomfortable closeness between fiction and technologies already being contemplated behind closed doors. These films introduced technologies that shone brightly for a moment, too precise, too grounded, too close to something real, and then slipped into silence. Hollywood did not build sequels around them, did not revisit their ideas, did not even gesture toward their implications. Instead, each concept was quietly set aside, as if the industry sensed it had wandered near boundaries no one wanted to cross openly. If you're still here, you've seen how these discarded futures hint at deeper currents beneath the surface of science fiction, and the archive is far from empty. There are more forgotten prototypes, more vanished theories, more films that may have revealed too much. The question now is simple: how deep do you want to go?